If June 1763 was the month of shock, a frantic period where the British frontier collapsed under the hammer blows of Pontiac's coalition, then July 1763 was the month of the grind. It was a month defined by heat, dust, and a suffocating sense of entrapment. In the Ohio Valley, the surviving British garrisons at Detroit and Fort Pitt were sealed inside wooden boxes, baking in the summer sun, watching the tree line for the flash of a musket. They were eating salt pork, drinking bad water, and dying of smallpox, waiting for a rescue that seemed impossible. To the east, the news was no longer a rumor. It was a flood of refugees. The roads leading into Lancaster and Carlisle, Pennsylvania were choked with families fleeing the scalping parties. The smoke of burning harvest fields drifted over the Blue Ridge Mountains. The Peace of Paris was a cruel joke. The war was not over. It had merely changed locations from the high seas to the American backyard. July 1763 is the pivotal month where the British Empire tried to stop the bleeding. It marks the launch of the Bouquet expedition, a desperate march by a Swiss mercenary and a ragtag column of Highlanders into the heart of the enemy territory. It marks the horrific climax of the siege of Detroit at the Battle of Bloody Run. And in London, it marks the quiet, bureaucratic decision to draw the Proclamation Line, a paper wall intended to solve a blood and soil problem. July 1763 was a month where the American colonists realized that their great victory over France had bought them nothing but a new and more terrifying war. So first, let's look at the refugee crisis on the Pennsylvania frontier. There was, of course, the human cost. By the first week of July, the Panic of 1763 had reached a fever pitch in Pennsylvania. The collapse of the forts in June, which were Venango, LeBoeuf, and Presque Isle, had left the western border wide open. This created a flood of refugees. Accounts from July described the roads to Lancaster as scenes of biblical exodus. The road was lined with women and children, wrote one observer, leaving their ripe crops to rot in the fields. In turn, this stoked an economy of fear. This refugee crisis was an economic disaster. July is the harvest month for winter wheat. By fleeing, the settlers were guaranteeing a famine for the coming winter. They were abandoning their capital, which was, of course, their farms, to be burned by the Delaware and Shawnee war parties that were now raiding with impunity within miles of the established towns. Unfortunately, this created something of a political paralysis in Philadelphia, where the government was locked in a toxic stalemate. This was defined by the Assembly versus the governor. The Quaker-dominated Assembly, which was safe in the East, was reluctant to authorize funds for militia. They cited religious pacifism, but deeper down, they hated the Scots-Irish frontiersmen almost as much as they feared the Indians. Unsurprisingly, this stoked massive anger to the terrified settlers in Carlisle. This inaction was treasonous. July 1763 is the month where the deep rift between the East, which meant wealthy, urban pacifists, and the West, which were poor, rural, and militant, solidified. This hatred would eventually explode in the march of the Paxton Boys later in the year, but the fuse was lit in the desperate heat of July. This ultimately fed the desperate gamble of Bouquet's expedition. The only hope for the West lay with Colonel Henry Bouquet. A Swiss professional soldier in British service, Bouquet was arguably the most competent officer on the entire continent. Unlike Braddock or Amherst, he respected the Native Americans as tacticians. He understood forest warfare, and in early July, he was in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, trying to assemble a relief column to march to Fort Pitt. What he eventually assembled was something of an army of invalids. What Bouquet had to work with was, quite frankly, pathetic. The British Army had been demobilized, so he had the 42nd and 77th Highlanders. This was his core force, consisting of Scots Highlanders who had just returned from the fever-ridden Caribbean campaign. They were emaciated, sick, and weak. Many had to be transported in wagons, and this was their mission. Bouquet's orders were to march 200 miles through hostile wilderness, crossing the Allegheny Mountains to relieve Fort Pitt. It was widely viewed as a suicide mission. The memories of General Braddock's massacre on the exact same road in 1755 hung over the expedition like a shroud. Nevertheless, his march began in mid-July. Bouquet moved out sometime in mid-July. His column was a slow-moving target, a train of pack horses and sick soldiers. But this was his strategy. Bouquet drilled his men relentlessly on a new tactic. If attacked, they were not to stand in lines, which equated to suicide. They were to form a circular perimeter to protect the convoy, then use mobile companies to sally out and flank the enemy. And this was the atmosphere in which they marched. As they marched west, they passed the ruins of burned cabins and the unburied bodies of settlers. The silence of the woods was terrifying. They knew the eyes of the Delaware and Shawnee were on them, counting their numbers, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. But that moment would come in August at the Battle of Bushy Run, but the tension built throughout the entire month of July. Then there was the stalemate and the slaughter that was the Siege of Detroit. See, the Siege of Detroit had basically become a war of nerves. The siege, led by Pontiac, entered its third month in July. It had settled into a bizarre rhythm. There was the French factor. Pontiac was frustrated. He needed the French inhabitants to join the fight, but they remained neutral, terrified of British retribution. He sent messengers to the French commander in Illinois begging for troops. And then there was the British condition. You see, inside the fort, Major Gladwin was playing a waiting game. He had two small schooners, the Huron and the Michigan, anchored in the river. These ships were his lifeline, using their cannons to keep the Indians back and making daring runs to Niagara for supplies. That all changed with the arrival of Dalzell on July 29th. Captain James Dalzell, which is also sometimes spelled Dalyell, arrived with 260 men, which immediately highlighted a huge contrast. You see, Dalzell was an aide-de-camp to General Amherst himself. He carried Amherst's arrogance. He had not lived through the siege. He'd just arrived from the safe east. He viewed Gladwin's defensive strategy as cowardice. That led Dalzell to demand an immediate offensive. He wanted to march out, attack Pontiac's camp, and end the war in one fell stroke. Gladwin advised against it, knowing Pontiac's strength, but Dalzell insisted. This ultimately led to the Battle of Bloody Run. On July 31st, in the pre-dawn darkness, Dalzell led 250 men out of the fort to attack Pontiac's camp. What he didn't know is that they were walking into an ambush. Pontiac was waiting. His spies had alerted him. He had his warriors concealed behind fences, trees, and wood piles along a narrow bridge over Parents Creek. This ultimately led to a massive slaughter. As the British crossed the bridge, the darkness exploded. The British were silhouetted, but the Indians were invisible. It was a massacre. Perhaps unsurprisingly, Captain Dalzell was killed while trying to rally his men. His head was cut off and mounted on a pike. Ultimately, this led them to retreat. The remnants of the force fought a desperate rear guard action back to the fort, saved only by the cover of the Hurons' cannons. And here was the consequence. Parents Creek ran red with blood, earning the name Bloody Run. The battle was a catastrophe. It proved that the British could not defeat the Indians in the open. It boosted Pontiac's prestige immensely and ensured that the war would drag on for quite some time. Then there was the biological warfare taking place at the siege of Fort Pitt. Fort Pitt had become an island in the woods. While Detroit fought, Fort Pitt in Pittsburgh rotted. First, there was the crowding. Over 600 people were crammed inside the walls. The heat of July turned the fort into a cauldron of filth and disease. And of course, they had to always contend with the enemy. The Delaware and Shawnee kept up a constant fire. They dug into the riverbanks, shooting anyone who raised their head above the ramparts. This led to the incidence of the smallpox blankets. It is in the context of late June and early July 1763 that one of the darkest chapters of American history occurred. First, there was the parley. During a parley in late June, Captain Simeon Accoyer and trader William Trent gave 2 blankets and a handkerchief from the fort's smallpox hospital to 2 Delaware emissaries. Those emissaries were called Turtle Heart and Mamalty, with the explicit hope of spreading the disease. The impact in July was this. By July, smallpox was indeed ravaging the Ohio tribes. Whether it was caused by the blankets or natural transmission, the disease was already present in the region, is debated by historians, but the intent of the British officers is documented in their very own journals. See, this really highlights the desperation. This act reveals the mindset of July 1763. The British officers felt abandoned by God and by King. They were facing a foe that they considered to be subhuman, and they were willing to use any weapon, even plague, if it somehow might mean their survival. The view from London was something of a paper wall. While blood flowed in Michigan, ink flowed in London. July 1763 was the critical month for the Board of Trade. In here they discussed the problem of the West. News of the initial uprisings had reached London. The ministry realized that their policy of economy had already failed. Allowing settlers to flood the Ohio Valley had sparked an expensive war. So here was their solution. The Earl of Shelburne, which was president of the Board of Trade, began drafting the policy that would become the Proclamation of 1763. This policy posited a line. The concept was simple. Draw a line down the Appalachian watershed. Everything east is for the colonists, and everything west is for the Indians. But here's where that runs headlong into a massive disconnect. In July, as Shelburne studied his maps in a cool London office, he believed this line would bring peace. He did not understand that thousands of settlers were already west of that line. He did not understand that land speculation companies, owned by men like Washington and Franklin, had already staked their fortunes on that land. So here's the irony. The proclamation was intended to save the empire money by preventing Indian wars. Instead, it would cost the empire its colonies by alienating the Americans who felt entitled to the fruits of their victory. As July 31st, 1763 ended with the shattered survivors of Bloody Run limping back into Detroit, the American colonies were in a state of profound crisis. The peace of 1763 was proven to be an absolute mirage. First of all, militarily, the British Army had suffered its worst defeat since 1755. But we also had to look at this economically. The Depression was deepening, exacerbated by the loss of the fur trade and the harvest. And this peace was also disintegrating politically. The frontier was radicalizing against the Eastern elite. July 1763 taught the colonists a hard lesson. The empire was not omnipotent. It could not protect them. And if the empire could not protect them, then why should they obey the empire? As the sun set on the bloody waters of Parents Creek, the stage was set for August, when Colonel Bouquet would meet the enemy at Bushy Run, and the fate of the American West would be decided in a single afternoon of bayonets and blood.